So I finished reading the volume 1 of the Gulag Archipelago, and it's a very magnificent piece of literature that describes what life was like as in the gulags and also the Soviet Union as a whole. I think that the most important takeaway that I took from reading the 630-page volume 1 was the fact that ideology is the excuse for atrocities and evil committed throughout history and will continue to be so going forward. Ideology allows people who individually would never undertake such a horrific and monstrous action the excuse to do so, the reasoning, the rationale. I mean, it doesn't matter if you go back to the Spanish Inquisitions and Christianity, or if you jump ahead today to present day modern ISIS, where people who individually would never do such a thing will collectively join and burn a pilot alive, or drown people, or throw people off of the roofs because of the ideology of radical Islam. This has gone on, of course, with the Nazis, who used race as the excuse to, and racial superiority as the excuse to murder millions and millions of Jews and gypsies, etc., etc. And the communists used the ideology of communism to justify their actions of imprisoning and torturing and murdering countless millions, far in excess of the number of Nazis, of the Jews killed by the Nazis. And if you take a look, over perhaps 100 million people died at the hands of creating a communist utopia. You simply cannot create a future heavenly place by creating a hell in the now. As Eckhart Tolle would say, it is always now. I mean, there are so many different stories throughout the book. You would be the harvest was owned by the collective, and even though people were starving in the Ukraine, even though their children, they had to have signs that your children are not to eat. There are posters that remain today from this era with that statement as a reminder, because this is how much people were suffering and starving. And if you so much got caught stealing some of the chaff that had fallen onto the ground, you were killed or imprisoned if you got lucky. Of course, imprisonment was basically just killing you. The people, there would be a couple of stories. There would be people that would go to the camps that were party leaders or somewhat high in the leadership, and they would go with these fancy coats, and they would be a little bit unsure of whether or not to leave them behind as they went to the shower. They would leave them at the behest of the guards who said who would want these things. They would come back and question, where is my stuff? And the retort would come, you left your stuff at home. This is communism. You own nothing. You see, everybody, communism is it's game theoretically unstable, in fact, game theoretically impossible, because everybody will act in their own best interest in order to keep themselves alive rather than in a collective self-interest. And also, when you have people at the front who know not what they're doing, who achieve their position based on their class-based position previously in society. In fact, the only way to reach the top was if you were at the bottom in the Soviet system, because the bourgeois, the engineers were not to be trusted. And you would have people the engineers were giving impossible tasks to produce for society in 5-year plans. And if they said that this could not be achieved, that this plan was far too ambitious, they were executed. They were not believers in the state. And if they did not produce such the results, if they kept their head down, they might live a little while longer, but then they would be accused of wrecking for not producing such plans. The system was completely inefficient. You would have people that would rise to the top because they were workers previously, peasants who did not know what they would do, who were murderous and wanting to extract revenge from those who had a little bit more than them, and they would absolutely destroy society. It was like arrest was like a virus, and if you were so much seen as shaking hands with somebody, weeks later, who was arrested as an enemy of the state, you too would often then be arrested by guilt by association. And once you got into the system, there was simply no getting out. It was like a boa constrictor just sucking the air out of you. You were gone. You were sent to the gulags. And everybody got a tenor. That was the euphemistic way of describing a 10-year sentence. There are so many horrific stories of torture, of people in power using their authority to imprison those that they don't like out of revenge, out of spite, over wanting their wife. If you were given the position of deciding on people's freedom, the blue caps they were called, you were given tremendous power. And no matter who in society knew you were a blue cap, you were treated with the utmost respect. Didn't matter whether somebody was technically higher in the dominance hierarchy of the Soviet Empire, and for example, in the Politburo. If somebody had the right to take your freedom away, you treated them like they were God. You did not want to piss them off in any way. And these blue caps would use their position. If they wanted somebody's wife, they would send that man, the husband, away to the gulags. Just like that. If they wanted an apartment, hey, they found a reason. Just send them away to the gulags, then that apartment's yours. And this is the way when people have power that is given to them by the state, and not on a meritocratic basis, but by a class-based system that simply does not work. It is one of the saddest things that I have ever read, and I'm just going to cut it off here just because there are so many other things that are in the book that could be described. And I don't know, you can go to the Soviet Union today and you can see all of this etched on people's faces, the older generation's faces. You can see it in their actions. Soviets, when you go to Russia, wherever you go, the closer you are to the epicenter of communism, the less they will invite a smile with you. And who can blame them? If you smiled at the wrong person, you said the wrong thing, invited a conversation that didn't need to be had, you got turned in. Somebody would rat on you. And whether or not you were guilty or not, you were sent to the gulags to death. So why invite a conversation? And as a loving parent, I'm going to teach this to my children. And that remains still today. When I was traveling in the former USSR, wherever it was that I was, Ukraine, Russia, Czech Republic, Poland, this is simply, you saw the destruction brought, the poverty that was brought by communism. And that's why these places are so much cheaper. Unfortunately, the people, not so friendly, and there's a reason for it, and I call it the hangover of communism. So this book just reinforces everything that I experienced while I was traveling in Eastern Europe. And to some degree, it also is the case in Vietnam. When I'm in Vietnam, although the people aren't unfriendly as they might be in Russia, they're far less friendly than the other countries surrounding them in Southeast Asia, whether it's Vietnam, Cambodia, and you think about the trauma that Cambodia suffered, you think about the millions of people that communism killed. Obviously, I am not a fan of this ideology. And just remember my takeaway. The fact is that ideology is the excuse that will allow you to commit any atrocity if it's done with a collective group of people, with enough people. And as human beings, of course, we need to organize as a group in order to survive. That certainly used to be the case. And unfortunately, communism, once you take away somebody's individual rights, and which are enshrined by the US Constitution, for example, the right to assemble, the First Amendment, the freedom of speech, and the right to bear arms, guess which were the first rights that the Soviets took away, that the Bolsheviks took away. And this is why we need to fight against anybody that wishes to take away any of these rights. And I'm not a big proponent of guns, but I understand the need to protect ourselves against a totalitarian government. Peace and blessings.